We weren't here last week. We were worshiping with friends at Covenant Presbyterians. We had a great day with them. And so we gather back into this place and return to a sermon series, What's Your Holy Grail? And so we've been trying to reflect on what we're up to, what we're after, what we're chasing, what we're dreaming and planning about, and trying to be reflective and prayerful about that together. And today I want to invite you to perhaps relax a little bit about some of your goals and dreams and Holy Grail plans. Nicholas Lemann's 1991 book tells the story of the enormous migration of black people from the rural South to cities in the North. That book is entitled The Promised Land, The Great Black Migration and How It Changed America. You may not know Lemann's book, but you may be familiar with Isabel Wilkerson's 2011 book, The Warmth of Other Suns. That's gotten lots of press and won lots of prizes. Wilkerson's book enriches and covers the same story that was told by Lemann. Between the First World War and the Great Depression, so roughly 1915 to 1930 or so, 1.5 million black people migrated from the South to cities in the North. Many of these migrants were drawn to cities like Chicago for better jobs and better pay. Because of agricultural innovations, the mechanical cotton picker was invented in 1944. The labor needed to pick cotton in the South was greatly reduced. So between 1940 and 1970, another 5 million black people left the South, headed north in search of a better life. Lemann begins his story in the small town of Clarksburg, Mississippi, in the Delta region, the richest cotton land in the world. There we meet a woman named Ruby Lee Daniels, and now I'm reading a few paragraphs from a review of that book. In 1946, Mrs. Daniels moved to Chicago, the promised land of milk and honey, and settled into a kitchenette apartment in one of the city's rickety tenements. At least there were jobs and money and excitement, and it seemed at times that the whole Mississippi Delta had moved to the south side of Chicago. The black population of the city increased by 77% in the 1940s, and another 65% in the 50s. At one point, 2,200 people were pouring into the south side of Chicago every week. They came by the thousands to make the South Side the capital of Black America, the largest contiguous settlement of African Americans in the country. Black people, once they got there, were gouged for higher rent. They were paid lower wages than whites. They were barred from good jobs, excluded from unions. They were thoroughly segregated in housing. Black against black violence increased. Street gangs took over. Racial violence in many forms broke out. Jump ahead now. In 1962, Mrs. Daniels, now Ruby Haynes, had moved with a new husband into an apartment in one of the new housing projects, hoping for a better life. But changes seemed for the worse. Jobs for the unskilled dried up. Her teenage son, Kermit, became the leader of a gang. Mr. Haynes cleared out and left with another woman. In 1979, then Mrs. Haynes, then age 62, took an opportunity to move back to her old home in the Delta. Her daughter Juanita, who struggled with addiction, and Juanita's 4 children moved in with their mother in 1988. 2 years later, her son Robert also returned home from Chicago. Life back in Clarksburg, Mississippi, continued to be violent and dangerous. We're talking this morning, as we have been the last few weeks, about our Holy Grail projects. What are we up to? What are we after? What are we dreaming about? How are we organizing our lives? What are we aiming at? In retelling this heartbreaking tale about black migration in the mid to late 20th century, I am not calling into question the dreams of these families for a better life. Big and bold dreams for a better life can be, and often are, a faithful response to God's goodness, a way of affirming our own dignity and beauty as God's beloved children. But I do want to remind you today that not all of our Holy Grail projects work out. And I want to persuade you that many of the Holy Grail projects worth pursuing will often be simple, ordinary, small-scaled attempts to build a better world nearby. For Southern black families in the middle half of the 20th century, migrating north for a better life, that was part of the Holy Grail. And places like Chicago were, in the terms of Lemann's title, the Promised Land. Ruby Lee Daniels and her family didn't make it to the Promised Land. Their lives in Chicago were bedeviled and complicated by forces of white dominant racism, unfair housing policies, discriminatory banking, and police practices. So they got a glimpse of the promised land, but they never got to enter. Now, with that story in mind, come with me to another story that Shirley has already previewed from Deuteronomy 34. This is the ending of the story of Israel's exodus from slavery in Egypt. They're wandering in the desert past Mount Sinai all the way up to the promised land. So this is Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 to 12. Listen now for God's voice speaking to you. Then Moses hiked up from the Moabite plains to Mount Nebo, the peak of the Pisgah slope, which faces Jericho. The Lord showed him the whole land, the Gilead region as far as Dan's territory, all the parts belonging to Naphtali, along with the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, as well as the entirety of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea. Also the arid southern plain and the plain including the Jericho Valley, Palm City, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to Moses, "This is the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I promised I will give it to your descendants. I have shown it to you with your own eyes. However, you will not cross over into it." Then Moses, the Lord's servant, died right there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's command. The Lord buried him in a valley in Moabite country across from Beth Peor. Even now, no one knows where Moses' grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyesight was not impaired, and his vigor hadn't diminished a bit. Back down in the Moabite plains, the Israelites mourned Moses' death for 30 days. At that point, the time for weeping and for mourning Moses was over. Joshua, Nun's son, was filled with wisdom because Moses had placed his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to Joshua, and they did exactly what the Lord commanded Moses. No prophet like Moses has yet emerged in Israel. Moses knew the Lord face to face. That's not even to mention all those signs and wonders that the Lord sent Moses to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his servants, and to his entire land, as well as the extraordinary power that Moses displayed before Israel's own eyes. May God bless the reading of Holy Scripture. This story about Moses dying outside the promised land might help us find a fresh approach to our own lives. It might help us reflect on how tightly we're clinging to our Holy Grail stories. It might help us find the freedom and the flexibility that comes from taking a breath and relaxing and loosening our grip. When Moses stands on the east side of the Jordan River, looking over into the promised land, he's facing the next chapter of a story that began long before him. He's playing a role in a story that began with God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We too develop our dreams and our plans within a stream of people who preceded us, grandparents and parents, teachers and community members, those who fostered good life in our neighborhoods, those who built the institutions and crafted the policies that shape our lives, those who wrote the books we read, and on and on. And we aren't the end of the line either. Life flows on after we're no longer here. It flows on to friends, to children and grandchildren, to a new world constantly coming to birth. But here we are today, in the concrete, ordinary specificity of our lives. Here we are, poised like Moses on the brink of something new and different, facing the future. And like Moses, the role we play in life is a limited one. Moses played a key role in Israel's release from captivity, in their formation as a people at Mount Sinai, in leading them through the desert toward the promised land. But Moses died in the land of Moab, outside the promised land. His life was characterized by important, though short and medium-range projects, we might say. Here's the thing. Moses' life didn't get its integrity or its coherence, its meaning or its value from fulfilling that project of realizing the dream of actually entering the promised land. The story emphasizes two features of Moses' life. I want you to catch this, and then we'll move on to talk about what this looks like for us. First, Moses' life is best seen in the context of intergenerational dynamics. That is, Moses inherits both the blessings and the challenges of the generation before him, and he leaves to those coming after him new forms of goodness and new challenges as well. Moses, did you notice, lays hands on Joshua, conferring blessing and leadership on those to come, on the next generation. The project came to completion, but it wasn't Moses who completed it. That role was for someone else. As I read this story, I think here of the countless stories of immigrant families, of grandparents and parents who made enormous sacrifices so that their children could be part of the American mainstream, attending college, earning a good living, contributing to American civic life. That's the first thing, the intergenerational part of all this, right? The second thing the story emphasizes is that Moses' death in Moab, outside the promised land, in no way subtracts from the meaningfulness and the significance of Moses' life. Instead, the story remembers the valuable contributions that Moses made to the community. The story doesn't get hung up on the fact that Moses didn't do it all, didn't cross the finish line. Instead, it pauses to celebrate that Moses was responsible for partial accomplishments and achievements that were important to Israel's well-being. So, friends, let me ask you, as we continue to reflect early in this year on our own Holy Grail projects, what if your plans and dreams for your life don't materialize in quite the way you had imagined? Can you imagine holding on to those dreams in a kind of loose and gentle way, so that if you needed to release them in order to receive some different kind of life, some alternative and unexpected kind of goodness, you could do so? I direct your attention to the screen. Joshua, if you'll put up that picture of the artwork. Some of you may be a long distance from the screen, so I don't know how well you can see it. But take a moment, if you can, and look at this piece of art. What do you notice? You don't have to say it, but I'll give you a minute. It's a circle that doesn't quite work. It's an incomplete circle. In fact, that's the title of the piece of art, The Incomplete Circle. I like this work of art because it invites us to move through this dynamic. First of all, sort of our desire for wholeness and completion. I really wish those lines lined up at the end, right? And then we can come to grips with our fear, our worry about incompleteness. And then if we can settle ourselves, then we can move towards this surprising and fresh recognition that incomplete projects can still be beautiful and meaningful. Or maybe I'm making way too much out of this piece of art. I don't know. You'll tell me later, I'm sure. I have a way of ruining poems and art. It's just part of what I do as a preacher. It's a gift. The story of Ruby Daniels blocked by injustice from the dream of a new life, the story of Moses dying in Moab, the image of an incomplete circle. These might help us begin to relax our grip on whatever it is that's functioning as our Holy Grail. Simply recognizing that life won't always rearrange or align itself with our deep desires can be, if we let it, can become an opportunity to breathe and to relax into the life we actually have. Honoring our limited place in the larger intergenerational sweep of time might increase our gratefulness for just being part of this flow. Might enable us to regather some of our energy towards worry, towards a more useful reallocation of those energies. As I have prayed and reflected about loosening my own grip on some of my dreams and desires, I found encouragement in an odd place. Buried deep in a 2-volume, 1,100-page theological text entitled Eccentric Existence, written by David Kelsey, and the picture of it will be up. There's this short reflection on wisdom from the teacher of Ecclesiastes. And according to David Kelsey, this unique, odd little strand of the biblical witness, this cynical, kind of realistic teacher of wisdom, calls into question some of our most common Holy Grail quests. The teacher in Ecclesiastes draws our attention to his own experience of pursuing a holy grail. Seeking wisdom, he says, he undertook a long-term, life-consuming building project. I made myself gardens and parks, this is Ecclesiastes 2, bought many slaves, acquired wealth, enjoyed many pleasures. So by his society's standards, actualizing this project is a great life achievement. In addition, by accomplishing the project, the teacher thought that he was actualizing himself, fleshing out his best possibilities, crafting a meaningful personal identity. Here's how he puts it in Ecclesiastes 2:9. I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. So not only did he think he was building a meaningful life with this long-term project, this Holy Grail project, he liked the way it singled him out as unique among others. The project buoyed his sense of worth by buttressing his way of imagining the meaning of his life. I'm doing something really important. But then things turn. The teacher recognizes that he will die, just like all the other fools who didn't commit their time and energy towards any meaningful projects. And so he judges that what he had done was, quote, all vanity and chasing after the wind. That's the second part of chapter 2. The teacher then proposes an alternative picture for how to be wise, how to seek one's own well-being, how to go after a holy grail, if you might put it like that. This is chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, and this can be on the screen. There's nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from God, who can eat or have enjoyment? So here's the interesting pattern that emerges in Ecclesiastes. First, the teacher attempts to manufacture a meaningful life through a commitment to a long-term project. Next, the teacher sees the futility and the vanity of all such projects given the reality of death. I can't stick around and see these things through. Finally, the teacher recommends directing our primary energy to the everyday pleasures, the simple, ordinary pleasures of eating, drinking, and working, that are themselves gifts from the hand of God to be enjoyed with the time that we have. So here's what Kelsey makes of this pattern. I'll put this quotation on the screen. See if this makes sense for you as we move through our series. We'll wrap it up next week. Quote, rather than binding the time and powers of one's life to a single lifelong project that transcends and unites everyday moments in order to make one's life a meaningful whole, it's better, perhaps, it's better to focus on short-term projects that help build the everyday world. I hope when you hear that, you just take a breath and relax. This doesn't have to be as hard as we sometimes make it. God, we're awash in God's gifts. We're called to extend that kindness to other people as best we can with the time and energy we have in the small corner of the world that we find ourselves in. Kelsey's point is that we ought to be careful about trying to give our lives meaning and purpose by investing all of our energy in these grand Holy Grail projects. We might want to be modest about our life-defining aspirations because they might not work. Or they might not endure the end of our lives and thus fail to provide the kind of coherence and integrity to our lives that we thought they would, which is why we were doing all this in the first place. But there's an even more important point that Kelsey wants to make, and it's this. What makes of our lives a meaningful whole is not that these lives of ours are unified by some lifelong project that actualizes our potential. What makes our lives meaningful is instead that God creates, sustains, helps, and loves us across a lifetime of all the short and medium-range projects we invest in, some of which won't work, by the way. Despite our best efforts to devote ourselves to building a better world, many, if not most of our efforts will fizzle or fade. And if the meaning and purpose of our lives derives instead from the way that God loves us, then we can survive the failure of our projects. If your life is centered in God's way of loving you, then death no longer looms as a threat to your attempts to manufacture meaning and significance. I think that's good news. Friends, let's grasp our holy grails loosely if we can. Let's welcome the large and beautiful truth that our lives are held and sustained by God's way of loving us and setting us into the world as God's partners and friends. Let's relax and breathe into a new kind of calm and joyful effort, knowing that our lives are worth living because God's love holds us, and not because we're investing in some particular life project, and not because we're actualizing our best possibilities across our lifespan. There might be deep joy in moving towards the promised land together, the journey itself worthwhile regardless of whether we cross the finish line or not.